because I wrote a book called Rancher, Farmer, Fisherman. The subtitle is Conservation Heroes of the American Heartland. It was also made into a film that aired on the Discovery Channel and I think can still be watched in Discovery's archive. I chose Environmental Defense Fund. I've worked there for 14 years, and we make a practice of reaching across partisan lines and working with people who are often written off as the enemy from the get-go. So we have long partnered with large corporations, and we've also long partnered with people who are producing food for the world at scale. So large-scale farmers, commercial fishermen, people in the shipping industries, ranchers, people who often come from conservative communities, who often vote Republican, but who are absolutely essential to stabilizing our climate and securing all of our natural resources for your futures. I will say that I am myself the mother of an 18-year-old, a freshman in college, and I am completely inspired by your generation. Watching the kids from Parkland who are standing up and changing the world gives me tremendous hope. I also, we always use 2050, and I've always thought that was kind of a mistake because it seemed so far off. But when I realized that my daughter will be 51 in 2050, which is younger than I am now, I realize it's really not far off at all. So I commend you all for the work that you're doing. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about the journey I went on to write this book. I traveled down the Mississippi watershed, which is really the whole heartland of America. It drains almost half the United States. And I chose that geography because, not only because it holds a lot of our natural resources, and it's been absolutely essential to American history, to our rise as a global power, but also because it maps almost perfectly with red state America. And a key motivation in writing the book was to push back against the idea that climate action or conservation are somehow liberal issues, democratic issues, blue state issues. They not only are not those issues, conservative and conservation come from the same root, but until we get past the partisan divide around them, we will not be able to actually solve these issues. So what I set out to do was to reveal the reality that there's actually a huge unsung movement in the heartland of people who are raising cattle and crops and who are fishing in coastal regions and out in the deep ocean to protect these resources. So I'll just give you a thumbnail on my book. Profiles 5 people. I'll give you a thumbnail on each, and then we'll come back later to questions, I think. So I started in the Rocky Mountains in Montana, the headwaters of the Missouri River, with a cowboy named Dusty Crary. He's a former rodeo champion who, in traveling around to compete in rodeos, saw the utter transformation of landscapes like his, the destruction of America's grasslands, the subdivision of epic old ranches, and the destruction of habitat for big animals, big carnivores like grizzly bears and wolves that actually require the ability to move between mountains and prairie. So Dusty led a group of people who had viewed each other as enemies for decades. He calls me a greenie, but so it was cowboys and greenies and outfitters, hunters, fishermen, and even federal bureaucrats, also not a favorite crowd out in the Rocky Mountains. But Dusty managed to pull them all together and to protect more than 500,000 acres of public and private land that is absolutely critical habitat, and to protect these grasslands that are critical carbon stores and critical habitat. I then moved down to central Kansas with a large-scale wheat farmer named Justin, whose family has been farming since homestead days, and like most large-scale farmers, had plowed and plowed and plowed those prairie soils, which we figured out a few decades ago when we came to understand molecular biology, that we were destroying the most important ecosystem on Earth by plowing up those soils, that the microbes in the soil are the most diverse ecosystem. The soils are the most carbon-rich part of the biosphere, and they're absolutely critical to holding soil, capturing water, and producing food. So Justin is one of many large-scale farmers in the heartland, another Republican, who is completely revolutionizing large-scale agriculture. They're not tilling their soils anymore. They're introducing huge diversity. I then went out on the Mississippi River with a barge, the CEO of a barge company, and ended up down in the delta of the Mississippi in Louisiana. Some of you may have seen the New York Times today, has a huge story about the jeopardy to that ecosystem. Both of those, the two characters that I focused on there is a man named Merritt Lane, who's the CEO of a multi-generational barge company, and Sandy Wen, who is a Vietnamese refugee. She fled after the fall of Saigon, and both of them are partners in the largest environmental restoration project in the world, an effort to restore the Mississippi's ability to pour sediments into its wetlands and rebuild its delta, which is, again, an absolutely critical ecosystem for fish and for birds, and provides protection against all of those climate threats that the first panel talked about: rising seas, intensifying storms, acidifying oceans. And then I ended out in the Gulf of Mexico with a commercial red snapper fisherman who has been really instrumental in reforming federal fisheries policy so that the total collapse in marine ecosystems and fish populations has been reversed. In the United States, we've succeeded in reversing overfishing in most of our important fisheries, in large measure because of the model that he set. So these are all pioneers who break every stereotype of what an environmentalist looks like. They are all innovating. They're living on the front lines of these climate impacts. They fully understand our interdependency with each other and with these ecosystems, and they are pioneering solutions that I found really inspiring and that I hope some of you will find inspiring in forging your own path. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nichols Silbersack. I'm here on behalf of New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer. I did not prepare a presentation because I thought we'd be more in conversation, but I'd love to tell you just a little bit about what we do at our office and some of our intersection climate issues that I think are of interest to us all. I am a policy advisor and a senior researcher to the Comptroller. I do focus on issues of climate, among other areas of focus. And I think the main relevance of our office to today's climate fight, looking out, seeing the demographic before me, I think would be divestment, which has been an issue that has galvanized the climate movement, has prompted a bunch of energy among young activists and older activists, and brought a whole series of people together to make a concerted call to ending the relationship of our cities, universities, other large institutions that hold sums of money, ending relations with major climate disruptors, the oil companies, the energy companies, and other folks. In early January, my boss, alongside the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, in conjunction and partnership with the trustees of the New York City pension funds, which total about $195 billion in combined assets, made a commitment to exploring the process of pulling that money out from a series of about 190 carbon-intensive companies all across the world, those that you've heard of, ExxonMobil, Shell, ConocoPhillips, and those that maybe you haven't, and taking that money out of those companies while simultaneously also launching efforts to put a large sum of our investment pool, we've talked about a number that approaches $56 billion, into green and sustainable energies that will power the future. It's a very long and protracted process full of research, bureaucracy, complicated conversations, but we're excited to begin it, and we're excited to get going on it, because it's time for us to stop looking after the next financial quarter and start thinking about the next quarter of a century, where things are going to look a lot different in this city of us that's ringed with about 520 miles of coastline. And we see the effects already of encroaching tides and greater storms and the urban heat island effect. And it's our responsibility as a city to do everything that we can to bring a greener future, to protect ourselves against the dangers of climate change. My boss, Comptroller Scott Stringer, for those of you in the audience that aren't intimately aware of what a controller is or what a controller does on a daily basis, which I'm guessing is the vast majority of the people I'm looking out to now, I still sometimes sort of struggle to figure out what we do, but he is charged with looking after the economic well-being of our city. We look after the city's books. We look after this giant pot of money in our pension funds. And so it's absolutely critical from our perspective that the city invests now, immediately, to try and stave off some of the harms that can come from climate change. A piece of research that we published 2 years ago that I was proud to take part in, so we actually overlaid a map of the new flood zones within our city. This map is sort of being contested now, but it's a pretty good barometer of what climate scientists expect that we can see in terms of inland coastal flooding within our city. We overlaid it on a map of property values to sort of, quantify what's at stake, to make a dollars and cents argument for how resilient we need to get and what we need to do to stave off complete climate disaster. And what we found is that in this city that I assume that we're all living in, $128 billion of property sits in the front lines of climate change. And it's an abstract way to talk about it, for sure. It ignores the fact that it's not just buildings and real estate, it's human lives, and it's indeed the very character of our city that's at stake. So I would be happy to answer questions about our divestment work, about our environmental record, and about what the city is doing. But I just wanted to introduce myself. Thank you so much.
My name is Jonathan Cloud, and I'm happy to be here today to speak about a number of projects that we're involved with. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Possible Planet. We started with a primary focus on clean energy finance, and so I'll talk a little bit about the PACE program, which we hope to get started in New Jersey this year. And we were incorporated originally as the Center for Regenerative Community Solutions, because that is what we ultimately think is part of this, the answer to this problem of climate change. But over the years that we've been working on this, we've also acquired a couple of other projects that we are the fiscal sponsor for. And one in particular addresses a number of the issues that have been talked about today. It's called the Global 4C project, and it's about financing the reversal of climate change. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. First thing to tell you is I'm not a millennial, as you can obviously tell, but I do have a daughter who is 28 years old. And so this is very important to me for personal reasons as well as for lifelong political reasons. I've been working on this problem, I just figured out, for the last 46 years. Started with the OPEC oil crisis in 1972. I was a young person hired into the Canadian government under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the previous Trudeau to the one that's currently running the country, who was a very progressive individual as well. And I got involved during that period in energy and environmental policy. and immediately or almost immediately became disillusioned with what government could do. And so I left the government, traveled a little bit, tried to decide what I wanted to do with my life, and ended going back to Ottawa in Canada and starting a company to build passive solar homes. Because it seemed to me that the solution was not primarily a matter of coming up with alternative technologies, but it was a matter of rebuilding the world in a way that made sense. If we look at the way that we build and have been building for the last 100 or so years, it's really very irresponsible and disconnected from the actual environment in which we live. And so that kind of got me interested in the question of how ought we to be building homes and other buildings. And along the way, I learned to be a builder. I became a real estate developer. Gradually, over a period of time, moved into the area of finance because it was clear to me that even though I'm not an economist by background, that economics is really the key driver of the problems that we have and potentially the key solution to the problems that we have. So our first project, as I mentioned, has to do with clean energy finance. How many people here have heard of PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy? So just a couple. I'll give you a very brief description of it. PACE is a program that started in California in about 2007. It was developed by the chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley, where all good ideas start, I imagine. And he came up with an idea for using municipal bonds to help people finance improvements to their homes and buildings, because he realized that the problem is not that people don't want to be environmentally sound or to have buildings that are energy efficient, but there's a capital cost involved. There's a requirement to invest in these improvements, and a lot of people just simply don't have the capital. And if they do have the capital, they often have other uses for it, which are, important to them as well. And so he felt that if it was possible to make financing available to people on a long-term basis, they could actually realize the potential savings for making these improvements to their buildings. Probably a lot of you have heard that if you put solar panels on your building or if you do energy efficiency upgrades, there's a certain payback period for that investment. It might take you 5 or 10 years to pay back the investment. Well, a lot of people don't have that amount of time to wait for the payback on an investment. And a lot of people don't know whether they're going to keep their buildings for that length of time to where they actually can have a sense that they're recouping the money that they're putting into improving their property. So the idea of PACE is that if a third-party investor provides all of the capital needed to make the improvement, 100% of hard and soft costs for these improvements, and the repayment of that is spread out over 20 to 30 years, then you can begin to realize some of the benefits, some of the profits on that investment right away if you're the property owner, because your payments on the improvements will be less than your savings from the energy efficiency or the production of solar. So that really was the origin of PACE. There is now PACE legislation in 33 states, including the state of New York and actually including the state of New Jersey. Unfortunately, in a number of these states, as is the case in New Jersey, the legislation doesn't work and has to be amended before the program will be successful. We started working on this in 2012 after the passage of the first PACE law in New Jersey, and immediately discovered that it was not workable because of certain features that had been built into the law by well-meaning legislators, but who did not understand what it was going to take to make this work. And every subsequent attempt to amend the legislation, and we've been through 3 or 4 of those, was rejected by Governor Christie, a Republican who initially acknowledged the existence of climate change right after Hurricane Sandy, but then promptly seems to have forgotten about it in the interest of trying to get the Koch brothers to finance his presidential bid. So he frustrated us for the past 6 years. And we learned a lot more about the legislative process than we ever intended to or wanted to. We're now at the point, thank goodness, that we have a new governor in New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy, who is committed to clean energy and who has indicated to us that he intends to sign the amending legislation which will make PACE possible in New Jersey. And we just had a market study completed by a consultant in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the conclusion was that there is a potential for investing approximately $129 billion in New Jersey over the next several years to improve the existing building stock, and that's simply commercial, industrial, multifamily residential, but not single-family homes. And if anybody takes the time to look into a little bit more about the PACE program, you'll realize that the residential portion is a huge opportunity as well. In California, in fact, it's probably 3 or 4 times the size of the commercial market. Over the last couple of years, people in California have invested, I believe, in excess of $3 billion in upgrading their homes. Now, it's also quite controversial because it does attach obligations to the property, and so there's some concern about what this will do to homeowners who really don't necessarily understand that what they're doing is mortgaging a piece of their future in order to get some benefits now and over the long term, savings in energy and reduction in carbon emissions. So in New Jersey, one of the things that we've decided and the legislature has decided is that we're going to implement commercial PACE first, try and make that work, and that's the potential $129 billion market, of which we actually expect to perhaps be able to achieve 0.1% over the next 5 years or so, which would be about $129 million, somewhere in that range. So that's the primary project that we're working on. But in addition to that, along the way, we were approached by an Australian civil engineer who had been working on the Great Barrier Reef and had begun to see some of the signs of the climate impact on that. And so he started trying to learn about this a little bit more, went to one of Al Gore's presentations as it happened in Istanbul, and came up with an idea that he thought might have some relevance, and which, along with our help, he has developed over the past 5 years into a policy proposal for central banks and international financial institutions. And I just want to mention briefly the logic behind this proposal, because you heard something about the fee and dividend program earlier, and that's a very important concept, but it is, in my view, woefully insufficient. And so you should be aware of why it is insufficient and what is really going to be needed to begin to reverse climate change, if that's what we as a species can achieve over the next 30 to 50 years. The essence of the fee and dividend proposal is that it's a kind of a tax on fossil fuels. It's a charge on fossil fuels. It recognizes that there are social costs to our burning of fossil fuels and tries to recoup some of those externalities, as economists call them, by charging a fee and then by redistributing that fee to ordinary citizens so that they can cope with the increased cost of consumer goods, as was mentioned earlier. The problem with that is that it does not do anything to address the challenge of investing in the solutions, the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier with improving buildings, with fighting to reverse the consequences of climate change. Some of you may be aware of a book by Paul Hawken that's just been released called Drawdown, which talks about approximately 100 technologies for reducing the carbon in the atmosphere, because it's not just a question of stopping putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. We actually have to remove some of the CO2 that's already there. As Bill McKibben would point out, we need to get to around 350 parts per million instead of the over 400 parts per million that we have now. Well, all of that's very important, but the challenge is how to finance the transition to a sustainable world. And the current estimate of that cost is approximately $90 trillion over the next 15 years. Needs to be invested in technologies and improvements, and in changing the way that we live and operate all of the systems in our society. And where is that $90 trillion going to come from? Well, governments certainly don't have it. Most of them are bankrupt. Most of them are incapable of raising the taxes and costs that it's going to take. And so we need to find some other solutions. And what Dr. Chen, who is the project leader, has really investigated at great length, is that in addition to the social costs, the actual externalities of carbon emissions, such as wildfires and floods and hurricanes and so on, there is a risk cost in addition to that, which any insurance company, analyst, or economist who's worth their salt would understand is the cost of avoiding catastrophe, the catastrophic effects of climate change, not just on the planet and the species who live on it, but from an economic point of view on the economy. Central banks and world financial institutions have a responsibility to try and make sure that our economy does not collapse as a result of the severe impacts of climate change. But we know that if we allow climate change to continue, if we continue business as usual and we let the temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius or more, which currently seems to be the expected projection, that we're going to face potential catastrophes that will destroy economies as well as ultimately us. So if we take into account that risk cost, which is part of that $90 trillion, the way that he has devised to begin to put that into circulation is through a process called green quantitative easing, which is the ability of central banking institutions to print money when that is needed to be invested in portions of the economy. We did that during the financial crisis in 2008. The Federal Reserve instituted quantitative easing. But what we need to do now in the face of the crisis that we're addressing is to institute a quantitative easing that is specifically directed at reducing carbon, financing all of the technologies in the drawdown study. And the way to do this without arousing political opposition to a great extent, which carbon taxes and even the fee and dividend have been stymied by, is to do this in the form of incentives for the solutions that we want. So it's basically built on the premise that it's not just the polluter who has to pay for the damage that's been done, it's the beneficiaries, which is all of us, who have to pay for countering those damages and restoring the Earth to a balance in which we and other species can continue to live in a way that's harmonious. So, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Toby Cumberbatch, and I'm a teacher at the Cooper Union. I seem to be a little bit out of step here. I got an email from Joyce much earlier in the week, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And I thought, talking about? I thought I was just part of a panel. So I prepared a presentation. And originally, I thought we all had an hour, so I thought 1 hour divided by 3, that's 20 minutes. And this morning I woke up and thought, sounds a bit long, so I got in touch with Joyce and she said 10 minutes, so I will do my best. So imagine walking a couple of miles balancing this basin of filthy water on your head. Fortunately, we don't need to imagine such scenarios. If we want water, we just turn on the tap and out comes fresh, potable water. We accept this as easily as we do the fact that nearly 20% of the world's population doesn't have access to clean water. Worse still, we piss into our pure water. I'd like to talk about the women who bear the brunt of extreme poverty, those who live on less than $1 a day, those whose day begins at sunrise and ends at sunset, the women who carry wood and water to earn a few cents to feed and clothe their children, the women who are resilient and resourceful, who know how to live with the land, who epitomize the dispossessed and the forgotten of our society, who can really teach us about sustainability. Now, will this work? Oh, yeah. So it's a shame that Sophie's grandfather couldn't be here today, because I would love to meet the man who persuaded his co-authors and journal editors to print the sentence you see on the screen. If it doesn't scare the living daylights out of you, it should. Extreme weather events, as we know, are nothing new. The difference is the frequency of such events. New York City is now predicted to experience major floods every 5 years, beg your pardon. Last April, I was driving down a road in northern Ghana, crisscrossed with ravines and potholes. Looking out of the window, the African countryside looked as it always did, startlingly beautiful in the failing light. Look a little more carefully, and the paths are dotted with women walking home in the dark, often barefoot, many with babies, almost all with a basin of something on their heads, be it grain, water, or everything you need for a market stall. All was normal. Then my smartphone vibrated. It had found a signal and gobbled up some data. To tell me what? Probably nothing important. I continued looking out of the window, and I don't know why, but all of a sudden the plight of these women overwhelmed me. I was in a car on my way to food, water, and a bed, and probably more bandwidth than I would ever need. My smartphone had absolutely no connection to this environment or the people in it, and I'm an electrical engineer. I first went to Ghana in 1958 and was introduced to the African woman. Large item on head, baby on back, often pregnant. I came back in 2001, nothing had changed and everything had changed. There was a tarred road, some electricity, and people looked much healthier. The landlines were as intermittent as ever, and there was no cell service. The industrialized world had computers, the internet, and obesity, but the African woman had barely changed in 4 decades. 13 years later, mother and daughter still tread the same path. Oh, man. We can't get technology right. Yeah. Large cities in Africa have become unrecognizable. There are cell phones, Pizza Huts, burgers, and shiny new cars. Walk a few yards beyond the end of the dirt road in 2017, and nothing has changed in centuries. Whilst these women may be trapped in the cycle of intergenerational poverty, I believe they can save us. Let's look at a small part of their lives. Here's a young girl at a borehole, surrounded by lots of empty basins. It's the dry season. The water trickles out, and it takes a long time to fill these basins. The women wait patiently in line, often for many hours. Sometimes they fight for water. They may arrive home well after midnight, only to rise again at 5 a.m. and start all over again. But they have no option. They can't just give up and go home because there will be nothing to drink and it's hot. Everyone's thirsty, and it's difficult to cook without water. I'd like you to imagine carrying 100 pounds of water on your head for a few miles. Add a baby on your back, you're possibly pregnant and it's very hot. Oh, and you might have no shoes and you'll probably be hungry. We wondered how far women carry water, so we went to Kadiri in northeastern Ghana and followed water. The size of the pot represents the size of the community, and the thickness of lines represents the quantity of water. In the dry season, everybody must go to the main borehole, over a mile for some. In the rainy season, those near the river can clearly have a much shorter walk. The problem is the water's dirty. It's shared with livestock, it's contaminated. It then becomes a trade-off. Do you carry clean water for over a mile, or dirty water for a few hundred yards and accept an upset stomach? Which would you choose? Let's look at energy, not energy in the way you or I think about it, but the energy that's available to the extreme poor, wood. Everyone knows that wood's disappearing. They can see the tree line receding and must walk further and further. But somehow there's nothing to be done about it. If you want to cook, you need heat. If you want bottled gas, you can't afford the deposit, let alone the content. With a grant from the NSF, we tracked wood over a period of 3 years. 5 a.m. every morning, we spread ourselves out around the village. As soon as we spotted someone with wood, we followed her to the wood market, a small patch of dirt in the middle of town. On the social scale, the wood carriers are the lowest rung. They really are the extreme poor. We got to know these incredible women. We got to play with their children, understand a bit about their lives, and gradually gain their trust. They took us to where they harvested the wood. They explained how they chose which branch to cut to ensure the tree lived as long as possible. They cried with laughter as teaching our students to carry these ungainly loads. Unlike a town in the industrialized world where these red lines might represent electricity and gas, these supply lines comprise women acting as human mules. I doubt anyone in this room can imagine walking 5 miles with 85 pounds of wood on their head and then selling it for $1. Yeah, a single buck. With this tiny amount of money, these women will go to the market and buy the absolute necessities for their family. Then they'll turn around and walk back home to collect water, work in the fields, wash clothes, cook, or whatever other household chore needs attending to. The next morning, they'll get up and they'll do it all over again. It's a life we cannot begin to imagine, yet at this very moment, there are hundreds of thousands of women carrying wood and water on their heads around the world. What happens when a major piece of infrastructure fails in the US? No problem. Someone comes along with a big machine and fixes it. What happens if there are no machines? Do you just accept the situation, in this case a breached dam, or do you fix it with the resources at hand? There is no choice. You dig dirt and you pay around 300 women 75 cents an hour to form a female chain gang and fill the hole. What would you do? Strange as it may seem, this brings us back to the smartphone. Africa is now covered with cell phone signals. But what do smartphones do for these women who carry wood and water? Virtually nothing. Sure, there are cheap phones with simple apps that bring important information to these outlying communities, and we shouldn't forget they provide a vital communication link, especially in case of emergency. But in some ways, anything that works in the bush is an unintended outcome. The apps are mostly inaccessible for these illiterate women, and where can you even charge the phone? Engineering in the industrialized world does nothing to address the lives of the extreme poor. The hundreds of millions living in poverty are not part of our engineering curricula. Somehow we manage to put our energies into innovations that make us lazier and lazier and more dependent upon the Internet of Things. We don't think about where food and water come from. We don't focus on clean energy supplies. We don't teach the smart engineering that nature uses every day, the principles that ensure perfect harmony and unity throughout our living, interconnected planet. We turn on a tap or go to the grocery store. We flick a switch and we get light. But as Sir James Lovelock wrote 10 years ago, we can't keep going like this. Business as usual will be the end of us, whatever we do. There's a conflict between humankind and the planet. We demand more than the planet can supply. We need to go back to James Lovelock's Gaia and treat the Earth and everything on it as a single interconnected organism. We need to live as one. In the USA, we laud lead and other such nonsense which do so little to address overconsumption in any meaningful way. We tag what should be the norm as green and think we're saving the planet. Let's imagine a different world, one in which there is a global dialogue between the rich and the poor, one in which the mighty giants in Silicon Valley address real problems. What if Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and all those others focused on the grand engineering challenges, such as the provision of food, water, energy, and reduction of waste? What if these masters and mistresses of innovation sought to reduce rural depopulation and shrink the gap between the rich and the poor? Such household names could change the way we think about the world and provide hope that we really can work together for the common good. Facebook reunites old friends, and Google flies airships across parched terrains to provide the internet to people who are starving and illiterate, neither fill an empty belly. When these companies change their priorities, to whom should they look for advice? To the arrays of academics distributed throughout our universities? To the World Bank, the UN, or any global institution? No. They should look to people like this peanut farmer in Jarapa and women like her who really know how to live with the land. They are resilient and resourceful, else they will not survive. Is the way she farms the most efficient? Is it the most productive? Perhaps not, but her farming is much more in harmony with the planet than our industrialized agriculture. Because she's doing more with less, she takes more care with what she does. She cannot afford to waste precious food. She doesn't have access to or cannot afford pesticides and fertilizers. She must use what's at hand. What else of the backwards technology still practiced in these remote rural areas? There are innumerable ways of collecting and storing water, farming and storing food, to name but a few. These are grain houses in Endi, Mali, on the edge of the Abandiagara escarpment. Believe it or not, they'll keep millet in good condition for 2 years, edible for 3. They're made of mud, wood, and a bit of straw and driven by the sun. So much for us to learn from these simple structures used for millennia. So much space for real innovation that looks to nature for inspiration, that thinks about design for place and culture. Looking south from the top of the Bandiagara escarpment, one sees a barren landscape, sandy soil scattered with small communities extending for thousands of square kilometers. And people have been living here for thousands of years. No FedEx or UPS. If you want something, you make it from what's at hand. Is everybody here starving and thirsty? Of course they're not. They're all fit and well. I often wonder what would happen if we were placed in this environment. Would we be able to survive? The question might arise sooner rather than later. As we've all heard, our supplies of natural resources are running out at a faster rate than most realize. Access will be severely curtailed. Climate change has arrived earlier than expected. We need to think seriously about our food and water. But back to the present. This is Francis Kerry's primary school in Gando, Burkina Faso. It's the most beautiful building in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And the only way to get there is to walk 5 kilometers through the bush. There isn't even a dirt track. It was built in 2001 using local resources. Where needed, the community were taught how to use modern imported materials. But the incredible thing is, it looks as good today as the day it was finished. In fact, it looks incredible and it functions beautifully. We spent a couple of hours sitting in a class, plenty of light, a cool and tranquil space, no electricity, no HVAC, daytime temperatures often in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Would we have thought of such a solution? Probably not. I said we had to learn a lot from the women of Africa, especially at 5:30 a.m. in this tranquil community that derives just about all it needs from the surrounding countryside. As an engineer, I feel compelled to work with these communities to help make their lives more comfortable. But seeing what a mess we've made, we need to learn to do better from these women who can teach us how to survive with far fewer resources, to do so much more with so much less. We squander natural resources as though they're limitless, the same resources they conserve, because they understand the life support system that Mother Earth provides. They're already coping with climate change. The rains no longer come in the month they used to, and when they start, no one knows whether it's the start of the growing season or whether it's just a shower. It's even worse when the rain does come. It comes down in torrents, washing away the seedlings, rushing off to the nearest stream and failing to recharge the aquifers. Situation is urgent. As economic disparity increases, so does the tension in the shanty towns in the less industrialized world. Climate change and scarcity of resources are accelerating the rate of rural depopulation. Major unrest is becoming more frequent in the self-organized communities of the poorer cities, where rising temperatures, insecure food and water supplies push people to extreme behavior. In 2050, it's projected that 65% of the world's population will live in cities. To me, that's a terrifying thought. How will we drive them? These women, tough as nails, are able to support their families and communities in the most extreme circumstances. What have you taken away today? Pity? Empathy? Or have you looked far enough ahead to see yourself in these images? I hope so, for then you'll realize where we are and just how much these women can teach us about living with the land, conserving resources and doing more with less, a new way of doing things. They can teach us about real innovation that uses technology for the benefit of all, how to ride life's ups and downs, how to become one world. Most important, we bring this learning back to the classroom, to the corporate boardrooms, the factory floors, and the inner cities. We change the way we teach engineering, we change our priorities. We strive to eliminate inequity, eliminate the cycle of intergenerational poverty, use our natural resources more wisely. We learn to live with the land, not off the land. You must and you can take the lead. It's your planet. You cannot rely on the old white men. They're too busy saving an extinct way of life. Look to the folks who live simpler lives. Look to nature, the supreme engineer. Design naturally driven systems to support human life. Thank you.
I'd like to take a minute, particularly to thank this panel. They may appear to be in very different venues in terms of the work that they're doing, but they're all sharing one pathway, and that pathway is to move toward a world of sustainability, each in their own way. We're in a time in history, a very important and critical time, because we're in an era of a fading industrial era, which was a very mechanistic period of time. We're now shifting to an era of sustainability, and that can only happen with more people who are focused on these kinds of directions, each in their own area, each in their own venue, doing everything they can to both educate people and to make some progress toward action. Are there any other things you'd like to talk about?
I mean, I'll pick up on a theme from the last talk, which is this idea of Thank you. I just wanted, well, two things. One, to just make sure that you guys know about EDF's own millennial effort, which is called Defend Our Future, which is another, and we also have something called Mom's Clean Air Force, which is another vehicle, both of them vehicles for young people who want to get activated on climate. We also operate something called Climate Corps, which is a training program for MBA students where we actually embed them in companies to do cost-benefit analyses for sustainability initiatives, and many of them now have become kind of the next generation of sustainability officers in these companies. I guess just to stir things up, I can say that I agree and I disagree with you. I agree that emulating nature is absolutely critical in thinking about how we use our natural resources and how we produce food. The farmer that I talked about, his model is the prairie. He tries to make his farm as much like the prairie that he inhabits as he can. He leaves all the old dead plant material to protect the soil. He keeps something alive and growing on the soil at all times. And he tries to to create habitat for the organisms that live there before we ever busted out all that sod. I would actually disagree that traditional farming methods are always a great choice. Looking at that stripped bare soil is painful to me. I think I'm a great believer in that we're in a great school of engineering and technology. I'm a great believer, as are you clearly, or you would not be taking your skills there, all of this cutting edge science that we're developing is actually one of our greatest assets. That the reason that these farmers in Kansas can move, they talk about how they're moving along a spectrum from chemistry to biology, that increasingly they're relying on biology to solve problems, not chemistry. And the only reason they can do that is because of the science of biology, because we can see into these worlds that we couldn't see into before. By the same token, companies like Google, they certainly have done plenty of harm in the world, but they also are often lending their leverage in the world for good. We have a project with Google, a methane mapping project, where we put methane detectors on every Google vehicle that is out in the world so that we can find where this potent greenhouse gas is leaking and address those leaks. So I just wanted to, I guess, make a shout out for the education that you're all getting and what the generational change that I saw when I was coming down the Mississippi watershed, and the transformation that the younger farmers and the younger ranchers and the younger fishermen were really driving. I think we're all really counting on you.
Well, Joyce also asked me to be the moderator, so I guess I get to ask the questions. So my first question to the three of you is, are we too late?
Well, I certainly hope not. Let's try that one. Maybe that's now working. Okay. Well, I certainly hope not. I think that one of the things that I see, I have to say that when I was growing up, I was much more of a pessimist than I am now. I actually was quite reluctant to even consider the possibility of having children, because I thought that I'd be bringing children into a world that was in the process of decay and decline. Because I grew up with rivers on fire, with pollution, as bad as what we see now in Beijing, in LA, and in other Western capitals. The remarkable thing is that we've found ways to address those problems during the course of my lifetime. And I believe that we can find ways to address the climate crisis as well. And that it's not just a crisis, it's also the greatest opportunity that humanity has ever faced. And that if we address this crisis to the extent that we need to, we'll actually produce a world that is much better than the world that we live in today. And we'll do that because we have to, not because it's a good idea, but because it's the only way in which we're going to survive and enable other species on the planet to survive. So that's my reaction to the question.
I'm being called on. I'm afraid that I am not a climate scientist. I'm not someone with any particular insight into ongoing climate models. I leave that up to the people uptown, the Goddard Space Institute. I leave that to the people that are far smarter than me and equipped with many more PhDs. I know that it is my responsibility on the behalf of City Controller Scott Stringer to be treating every day like it's an opportunity, like there is an imperative to correct actions here in the city, to pursue policies that fix some of these problems. I think you're absolutely right to say that there's opportunity embedded in this challenge, whether it's to erase some of the existing health inequalities that you see with old heating systems in New York that are belching out choking smog that are causing asthma, but are also polluting the climate. So finding solutions that address those situations is the work that we do. I will say that on behalf of my boss, Scott Stringer, who, you know, I am actually very privileged and honored to work for, because I think he's very honed in on these issues and very focused in on them. It takes a lot. It takes, you know, really this whole city to build coalitions, to get movement on these issues. And progress has been slow. It's been stalling. We've gotten to a place where we're in imminent danger. We're in danger of these storms. We're in danger of reaching thresholds where cycles perpetuate the harm that keeps on happening. And so I'd only say to whatever audience I'm speaking to everybody in this room that, you know, it's absolutely imperative that we keep going, that you put pressure on elected officials, you demand that they're accountable to your future and the future of this planet, but also that we work together to identify things that we can fix and things that we can tangibly change.
And I would just add, you know, sitting next to someone with a lever of the size that you have to use to change the world is really reassuring, and seeing, and I would just urge you to focus on those places where change can really happen at that magnitude. I mean, New York has been really fortunate. Mayor Bloomberg continues to be out in the world helping transform cities all over the world to be more climate sustainable and supporting a move away from coal. Our Attorney General has been driving really important fights to step in where our federal government is failing us right now. And I just, to take heart from people who are taking these extremely powerful institutions and using them as a force to move us forward should be reassuring.
I don't know whether anybody saw the New York Times this morning, but there's a long article on a small town in Louisiana, and they're debating whether or not they have to leave it. I certainly agree with all my colleagues, but I guess I'm more pessimistic because I see a lot of inertia. And that brings me to my next question is, can we achieve what we need to do through incremental change, or do we need to be much more aggressive?
Well, I don't know about aggressive, but I do think that we need a profound transformation in our consciousness. And it's not just a matter of incremental change in the way that we do business now. We know that if we continue to do business the way we are doing and continue to be driven by the economic arguments that we are, you know, subject to, that we likely will not find the solutions we need. I think that where we connect is in the sense that all of us as human beings need to recover our relationship with the earth, with Gaia, as you described, and to look at everything that we do every day from the point of view of our responsibility to the environment that gave birth to us. And that if we don't look at it that way, if we continue to be blinded by short-term objectives, however well-meaning we are, it will not be sufficient. So what's needed in terms of the coming transformation is a transformation in consciousness. And I think that occurs at the level of kind of global awareness and global thought, and that it's beginning to shift, that in just about everyone that you will read on any kind of, you know, intelligent level on a global basis is recognizing this. And there's a clear line of demarcation between those people who are busy resisting and those people who are forward-looking and are trying to bring that consciousness to the majority of the population, because that's what we need.
Yeah, I would just offer up this perspective. I mean, when we talk about climate change and its effect on our daily, you know, lived experience, we know that the results can be cataclysmic. We know what is to come. We have a pretty good idea of that. And it seems insane, I think, just like instinctually, to think that why aren't we doing these things? why aren't we going? And why aren't we going faster? Why aren't we going farther? Why isn't there a solar panel on top of every roof? Why aren't we making drastic cuts to growth? Why aren't we doing X, Y, and Z? And that's a question that we have to grapple with. It's hard because achieving change is hard. And I say this as a mid-level bureaucrat sitting in the back of a city, city office building in a cubicle. Even something, for instance, I spoke a little bit earlier about our divestment campaign. The city controller, I think it was a big deal. The city controller and the mayor, alongside the trustees from our pension funds, made a commitment to studying divestment. There were many in the community that were very pleased by that result, and there were some that, were interested in faster results. But when we look at, just to use this one particular issue as an example, when we looked at divestment, we of course have the same interest that everybody else does in preserving our planet, but we also have other obligations to handle. This $195 billion pension fund isn't just a pot of money. It represents the future retirement savings of about 700,000 city servants who depend on that money. And it also is constrained by a whole series of laws and regulations that dictate exactly what you can do with that pot of money. And so when we come out and we say that we are going to study this issue, that we are going to look at it, people, sort of raise an eyebrow and talk about incrementalism and talk about, why aren't we moving faster? Why aren't we seeing a change immediately? And I would only say that this is a scenario where the people that are looking at this, we get it. We understand that the temperatures are rising, that the ocean is encroaching on our shorelines, but you still have to get from A to B to C to D. You have to do the hard work of every day, changing policies, participating in politics, and that's really, I think, what is going to require the energy of everybody that's interested in this issue. Making sure that you are not, so focused on, I won't phrase it that way. Making sure that you are investing energy in the daily, in the daily fights that matter, that retrofit more buildings or, create more sustainable farmlands that produce food. And if we sort of go inch by inch, I hope we get further.
I'm wondering, are there questions out there from anybody? Yeah. I don't know if that mic works, but.
Okay. So one thing that I kind of personally have grappled with while I've done work with looking into sustainable technology is just the embodied energy that is within all of these innovations that we're currently using. So personally, I hear so much about policy that encourages, the use of clean energy, but then you really look at the clean energy and it's using these rare earth metals that are completely destroying environments just to extract them. And I look at, using energy without necessarily cutting back. We're still living the same life we're living. So I'm curious about what you personally think about the relationship between looking at innovation and the embodied energy currently involved with innovation, and is it worth it now to continue doing these things that are still producing so much waste in our environment just by making them, versus changing lifestyles completely? So maybe cutting things completely out of your lifestyle. How do we grapple with that as a society, especially as a society that's so reluctant to change?
Well, the book I wrote before this book was called Earth the Sequel, and it's the subtitle is The Race to Reinvent Energy and Stop Global Warming. And it kind of was a look across all of the cutting-edge energy technologies and the need for the kind of life cycle analysis that you're talking about. I mean, biofuels, for instance, prove themselves to be an uncertain proposition and often a bad bet in terms of the net energy that you are getting out of them. That book led us to participate in EDF to participate in a project that you might want to look at called Pecan Street in Austin, Texas, that really set about tackling that whole system view that you're addressing, and that's an absolutely critical view to think about the whole system and all of the knock-on impacts. And it's true in agriculture, it's true in anything we do, that if you focus too narrowly on something that looks like an obvious good, like eating local, if you look actually holistically, sometimes it's not actually the obvious good. Sometimes it's the lesser option. So in Pecan Street, we had a team that we decided you start at the end of every possible efficiency, that first you make sure every building is efficient, you make sure every transportation system is efficient, that you deal with the waste end first, and that you only move to things like solar panels once you've made sure that you've squeezed every bit of waste out of the system. And then we did actually with the help of NASA, we did a rooftop survey to figure out how to deploy solar panels so that we were in the absolute maximum productivity. And that turned out west-facing in Austin was better than south-facing because their peak electricity use is late in the day when everybody gets home from work and cranks on their air conditioners. And so doing that kind of really deep dive and thinking across all of the ramifications is critical, but I still think in many cases you come out way ahead. I mean, the materials issues are yet another question, and I think increasingly we're synthesizing materials that can substitute for a lot of these destructive materials, but I commend you for thinking that way, but there are projects where people are really trying to think in that really holistic way.
This is a really challenging question in many ways because you can criticize almost anything. And, we're learning to think about cradle to cradle and holistic life cycle analysis and things like this. But just to give an example of one of the things that we in New Jersey are currently struggling with, we have several nuclear plants which represent a huge amount of embedded energy already in the buildings, and where the production of energy from those plants does not create any further carbon emissions. So one of the challenges is that the productivity of those nuclear plants, the profitability is now in question, and recently the whole political structure has been forced to deal with the fact that public service and gas has confronted the New Jersey government with the fact that if we do not come up with an additional $300 million in subsidies to keep those plants running for another 15 or 20 years, we are not going to be able to substitute enough renewable energy for them, and we're going to end up building new gas-fired plants which will produce more carbon in the environment. So, for me in particular, this is a kind of an agonizing choice because I spent the first half of my life fighting nuclear energy for all the obvious reasons, that it creates waste with plutonium that we haven't even begun to deal with yet. But I think on balance where I come out is that we do need to keep these things going. And we need to come up with the money to do it. And it's particularly difficult because that is a trade-off against the idea of investing more in solar. And so what the new governor has done is to try and marry those two things together. He's put together an omnibus bill that includes the $300 million for the subsidy for nuclear, and it also includes a commitment to move to genuine renewables by 2050. So, it's a balancing act, and there's no way around it. We have to deal with the world as it is today and find solutions that are the best solutions we can come up with.
I have no insight into that question.
Well, you know what I think, Ariana. I completely agree with what everybody said, but I think we should push more for complete life cycle analysis. But I also think that one of the things that's so often missing is what can you do with what you've got? You know, we keep saying we need more of this and more of that, and we don't really stop and think, well, you know, can we keep the house a bit cooler by opening a few windows, having a few fans? Can we put on more clothing in the winter? Can we do all sorts of things which actually reduce our demand rather than looking at ways to to deliver, quotes, sustainable demand? So on top of a life cycle analysis, you know, what can you do with what you've got to hand?
Hello. I just have a question for Mr. Silbersack, because at Ramapo we've been involved in some planning for divestment, or talking to the college pension or the foundation investment committee about it. We're still in the early stages, but I was just wondering if you had insight on the process of how you know, convince the relevant people of why divestment was the right choice, or how you arrived at that choice even. And how you go about the process of discussing that, because of course there are people with vested interests here that don't necessarily relate to environmental sustainability, like you were saying before.
Yeah, the point that I was stumbling around before and probably making way too inarticulately is I think you do have to be cognizant of some of those issues. You know, presumably an endowment at a college like that represents scholarship money for people. It represents the ability to safely steward the university through rough times when they come ahead. And, you know, as somebody that sat on the other side of the desk from people that were coming and pushing us to divest, I was always very sympathetic to the aims of all those activists who did tremendous work and continue to do tremendous work and mobilized. And, you know, it's very convincing, especially to a public official like my boss, Scott Stringer, when you're barraged by letters and mailings and all those things. And I don't have to tell anybody about the traditional techniques of that sort of activism. But I would just encourage you, just have these sort of frank conversations, because it's about weighing things. It's about weighing the benefit of divestment, which, you know, in some cases sort of attenuated, because you don't see an immediate impact. When you divest, it's not like suddenly you're, you know, shutting down a coal-fired power plant over there, but it, you know, it does speak very strongly about the direction and the purpose and what is driving us. And you weigh that with what the person on the other side of the table has to deal with, which is probably a lot of bureaucracy, probably a few laws, regulations, ordinances that have to change. And you know, I hope a productive conversation can happen from that. Something that's also tricky too, and again, I hope some of this is interesting, that we sort of had to grapple with is, and this is a place where I think divestment really can catalyze some real change, is a lot of the times it's actually quite hard to know what stake institutions have in carbon-intensive companies. It's not like we have a safe in the office that I work with down by City Hall that you open it up and there's just 1,000, you know, shares of Exxon stock. We invest with all sorts of partners in the financial world. They do the investment work, and we guide them, and we have trustees that look very carefully, and we sort of dictate terms. But hopefully, you know, an opportunity that you can sort of see that might go hand in hand with the investment, and something that our office did last year, is you can say, well, what are we doing to drive growth in renewable energies? What are we trying to do to drive growth in, you know, most places have real estate portfolios, trying to encourage energy efficiency. And so that's sort of a separate side conversation you can have. We decided that we were going to open up a manager search, an investment manager search, which we said there's $56 billion available to investors that come to us and say, we want to invest this money using, they're called environmental, social, and governance priorities. And you know, we've fielded a lot of interest from that, and now a lot more of our dollars both achieve a responsible return, because I need to emphasize that we have to do that on behalf of our retirees and on behalf of the city, because it's everybody's taxpayers' money that funds this pension fund. But while you maintain, it's called your fiduciary responsibility. You throw that at the people across the table from you, and they'll be very impressed that you're right up on that. But while maintaining our fiduciary responsibility, we're also saying we can do positive things to benefit the environment, and we can also move away from an economic system that is, I don't know, I think inching towards its demise because we just can't keep doing what we're doing in terms of our carbon output. I hope that's helpful in some way.
Well, I hope at this point everyone's knowledge is enriched by what they've heard today. And we want to thank the panelists for their telling us with their passion the importance of the topic that we're all here to care about. We're going to take a 10-minute break and look forward to the next panel, which will focus on new pathways to sustainability, new promise for the future.